Hello, and welcome to Narrative Design for Computer Games. We're delighted to have you with us for Comic-Con at Home. And I'm going to have our wonderful panel introduce themselves. So let's go down the line here, starting with Neal.
Hi, my name is Neal Hallford. I've been working in the game industry since 1990. The majority of that time that I've been in the industry, I have worked in some capacity as they called it writer back in the days, or actually started off as a writer and designer, and sort of climbed up the ladder. And I've done pretty much everything in a design department, but still most of my job is revolved around writing. And so the projects that you would know me for are primarily older titles, but Magic series, Planet's Edge, the one that everybody knows probably the best is Betrayal at Krondor, Dungeon Siege. I worked with Chris Avalon on Champions of Norath. And so that's sort of the highlights of sort of what I've done in the past, and I've had some cool stuff coming up, but I'll pass on down the line for our next panelist.
Anne?
Hi, I'm Anne Toole. I am a freelance writer based in Los Angeles, and I've worked on a bunch of different titles from small mobile games to AAA games. So I worked on the original Horizon Zero Dawn, and the sequel was announced yesterday. And I also was the lead writer for the last DLC for Assassin's Creed Origins. And again, I work in different media, so I'm also doing a comic book set in the world of Horizon, which is a sequel to the first game, and a prequel for the second. And that's what I do.
All right, great. Xalavier?
Hello, everyone. My name is Xalavier Nelson Jr. I'm a narrative director and writer working in video games. I have shipped over 30 games in the past 4 years, and among my current projects are Skatebird, Hypnospace Outlaw, an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, and We Are the Caretakers, which is getting a beta in a few days and is an Afrofuturist squad management RPG.
Awesome. And then Harris?
Hi, my name is Harris Orkin, and I previously was a screenwriter, and about 15 years ago, I worked my way into video games, and I've worked on quite a few titles since then. I started with the Command & Conquer games. I worked on Kane's Wrath and Red Alert 3. I started working with a company called Techland, and I wrote the Call of Juarez titles. I worked on Dead Island with them, and then I moved on to Dying Light. I wrote that. I was one of the team of writers on that, but I also cast and direct voiceovers. And so for most of those titles, I also cast and directed all the VO. And I worked on The Division, and I was a writer on Mafia 3. And I just saw yesterday that 2 games I worked on are not going to be on the Nintendo Switch. It's going to Ruiner, which is the cyberpunk game, which came out about 2 years ago, and Call of Juarez Gunslinger. And so that's who I am.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So what is the role of a narrative designer on a game team?
Anybody else want to take that?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, it's when I first started, there was no such thing as a narrative designer. That no one had come up with that term yet. And so I was hired as a writer. And though I realized that I had to integrate what I was doing with what was happening in the game. And, that's what a narrative designer eventually becomes. But now it seems like there's very different levels of narrative designers. When I worked on The Division, there were people on the team there who just were narrative designers and implemented and made sure that the narrative fit within the whole game. And then individual writers would just write different parts of the game. So I kind of think it changes depending on what studio you're working at, honestly, because every single game seems to be done differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of the same deal whenever I got started, because I tell people all the time, that whenever I got in my first job, as they hired me as a designer, but I had no idea what exactly I was getting into. They told me that you're going to be writing science fiction and fantasy, with a contract, but beyond that, I wasn't really sure what was going to happen with that. And so, and of course, my experience before that was like a lot of people of my particular era was, we started off with, the pen and paper role-playing games. And so being dungeon master on for D&D, or a keeper for Call of Cthulhu and that sort of thing, you basically were a storyteller, and you were figuring out how to create a world, and you're communicating everything purely by speaking, by talking to the players. And so whenever you translate that to an electronic medium, back in the day, it was primarily text. There were graphics, but it was really, graphics were just there to kind of help evoke the moment, but you were doing a lot of still typing and describing things. And so but yeah, it's a pretty interesting development, because you're at one level, you're crafting the narrative for what the world is, but you're also writing the dialogue, and it's a lot different than I think it was when we got started, because originally it was about this linear concept of linear story, and we can get into that later in the panel. But yeah, it's definitely a role that started off as being just like a traditional storyteller, but now it's actually helping create the universe and giving texture to the universe that's there.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I consider myself a narrative designer, and to me that means more than implementation, though I've definitely, like Kara said, worked on games where the narrative designer was the person who implemented our wonderful words. But for me, narrative design is lacing the narrative through the entire design. So there's a tendency, it's like, oh, you're a writer, you just write dialogue. No, it's about telling the story through every means possible. And in games, that includes the mechanics, that includes the animation, the art, everything that you can get your hands on, basically. But not every project wants a narrative designer in that regard. And sometimes they just want a writer, and that's okay.
Yeah, I'd say this is part of why it's so essential to, as a writer or a prospective narrative designer, get as much experience as you can with different pieces of the game development pipeline, the people who are actually going to put your words or your narrative design to practice or bring it to life. Because the more you know about their constraints and what they're doing and how they're doing it, the more effective you will be in your position creating a more cohesive final vision. And because games are built up of so many different modular pieces, here's the art, here's the game design, here's the writing, the more effectively those things fit together, the better the game feels. So as a writer, sometimes you'll just be called in to write, but if you're still doing it within the consideration of what is the player actually doing, what are they actually feeling at any given moment, what does the team want to accomplish, and how can you enable that with your own set of narrative skills, you'll be in a fantastic place to make a game substantially better with words, or with even just the structure that you introduce to how people go from one area of the game to another.
Yeah. Very good point. Very good point. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think that's how, over time, I started to realize if the rest of the departments weren't on board with what I was doing, it was things were going to go awful very quickly, and and that happened to me on a couple of early titles. So I guess so I ended up becoming a narrative designer. Basically, I had to work with the art, make sure that the art department and I were on the same page, and it's true with, like I said, with the game mechanics and every pretty much everything. And I realized that a big important part of my job as a writer and narrative designer on the game is establishing that idea of the world and making sure everyone was unified around it, and writing documents so everyone could kind of see what the idea of the world was. Though then I also started to realize that no one wanted to read the documents, so I had to write very short documents and actually go around from desk to desk and explain it to them in person. That even worked better. So
yeah,
very good points there.
Yeah.
I think
Good.
I was just gonna say, I think every narrative designer has that project where they realize, oh, It doesn't matter what I write in this document or in this piece of documentation or what I told this person. If the rest of the team is not also moving in this direction, it's just not going to happen. Or they'll just stick in my words in one place, and they're just sticking the rest, and none of it will make sense.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that was sort of, the catch-22 of the situation is that because at one level, particularly when you're dealing with narrative, you want everything to hang together. You want everything to be cohesive. And as they were saying, as everybody else was saying, is that you want the art and the design and everything to work hand in hand. And so that means spending a lot of time defining what the world is, why things are the way they are. But the problem is that the more convoluted that becomes and the larger the world becomes, that document becomes gigantic. And then you're going to have a certain portion of the team that will never read the document, no matter what you do. And you spend a lot of time sitting in a room with people. Okay, since you don't want to read it, I'm going to sit here and talk to you, and we're going to have a 5-hour conversation about what you could have read in the design document. But it's a catch-22, because if you don't write it, if you don't put it down, I guarantee you things are going to go off the rails. So it's one of those things where you have to realize half the team will read it, and there's a good portion of those people who will really dig it and get into it, and there's going to be other people who just don't care. You could write 10 sentences, or you could write 3,000 pages. It makes no difference.
So you end up becoming a cheerleader for the narrative and making sure everyone knows. Pretty much everyone in the team is a storyteller. Every single person has to be part of this storytelling, and and if that's not happening, and so it also just empowers them, and so part of that is, I think, giving them room to come up with their own part of the story that then you'll incorporate in the overall, to me anyway, because that no one wants to be told what to do. It's like, they're all creative people, and they all need to have their own inspiration, I think. So
yeah,
some wonderful points brought up here. And I didn't really introduce myself when we were getting started, but as some of you know, some years back, Neal and I wrote a book together called Swords and Circuitry, A Designer's Guide to Computer Role-Playing Games. And for quite some time, it was used as a textbook in classes at schools where game design and game development are taught. And I remember we got invited to speak at some of those classes. And at one, I was talking about how I would encourage anybody interested in getting into the industry to not only know as much as they could about the game experience, but also to learn as much as they can about the roles of the other people on the team, and with the work they have to do, and the order in which things have to be decided upon. How deciding to have some feature added has consequences if you're already past a certain point in the game. And I didn't even have to ask who the future programmers were when I mentioned that, Neal had been working on a game where suddenly, well into the process, someone decided or suggested that there should be spiders that could not only climb up walls, but go across ceilings, upside down. And everyone that thought like a programmer, their eyes were bugging at the thought of suddenly have to do all that work. And so now some people that go into narrative design have a good background in that. But even if you are not a programmer, if you want to be a writer for games, just as if you want to be a writer for anything else, learn about the other people on your team and what they do. And something about the timetable of when you can and can't introduce things, because it's amazing how many times some of those issues seem to come up in companies.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to get your hands on the game as soon as possible and get into the process as soon as possible, because once you're playing the game, even an early build, you'll get a good idea of what the mechanics are and what you can pull off in the game and how to tell the story in the game. So
yeah, I'm a big fan of black boxing stuff as early as you can.
There's also in accordance with this, there is when you're working on a game, it's important to keep in mind with timelines how early narrative does get locked down. So if you're working on a game that has voice components, you, as a narrative designer and writer, may have to have your hands off of the dialogue as much as a year before the game comes out. And in between that time, the game is going to change. And so part of your work and your discipline as a narrative designer is to, okay, this entire critical moment and scene, we don't have budget to do that cut scene, or that entire level was gone. How do you, without using voices, string together the rest of this experience? As a narrative designer, you are a problem solver. That's the exciting and the difficult piece of the work. So the more flexible you are and earlier you get your hands on the game, the sooner you can determine how much flexibility you have for solving the problems that you're going to be given.
Yeah, I mean, I recently worked on a game. They haven't announced it yet, but so I can't really say what it is, and I probably shouldn't. But they you know, it was already pretty far along, and so they had all the character models, all the locations, everything, but they really did not have the story. So it was like writing a movie where you have the locations, you have the actors, you know where you have to be and what you have to do, but there's no story there. So you have to kind of build it around what's already existing, which probably I think happens a lot. You know, at least it's happened to me a lot.
It happens a lot. I mean, it is. Of course, it's amazing because whenever you've had the opportunity to be there from square one, and you know you're writing the story and you're kind of walking along with the design, that's great because everybody's on the same page. But yeah, I've been in that same situation where I call it a box of rocks, because you just walk in and they hand you, here's this stuff. Everything in this box is the way that it is. You need to explain why it is the way it is. And make it work.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask about, you know, because a lot of people might assume you just go in and just get to just the creativity flows and you come up with this wonderful concept. But, you know, do you commonly go into a case, most likely, I think, you know, probably a lot of you come into something where there's already a lot of stuff decided. You know, there's a particular engine maybe being reused from a prior game. There's certain assets that they want to use, or, you know, maybe somebody has already come up with elements they want you to use, and it's your job to make it make sense. I mean, speak to that a little bit, you know, that's real. I think for most of you, that's got to be real life, where you just have to jump in and start, you know, as Xalavier said, you know, make some sense out of this and solve the problem. So can you speak to that a little?
I was just going to say, I think, Anne, with your range of experience, you'd be able to relate how this also crosses over with film and with comics and all these other different mediums.
I'm not quite sure how it relates to the other mediums, but I guess it's, you know, I work on a lot of established IP. So a lot of the time it's like, this is already the world, and you can only play in one section of it. And depending on who the IP holder is, they might have very strict rules about it. Conversely, I've worked on stuff that was based on IP, but they let you do anything, to the point of, well, why are you using this IP then? You know, why did you go through the trouble of licensing this IP? You could have created something original. And so it can definitely vary. And Jana had said something about like, oh, you're working on a different engine. I definitely had that experience where, moving across multiple projects, I'd worked on a project that had a really great engine with lots of flexibility. And then I worked on this other project and I was like, oh, well, we'll just do this. And they're like, we can't do that. And I'm like, you can't do that? It's like, this is a big deal that you can't do that. And they're like, no, that's just the way it is. And you're like, oh gosh. So that can be a letdown. The goal is to get better and better and better engines, rather than, oh no, I have to dial back what I had in mind. But it's normal because I do work in different platforms. So like, for example, mobile is not going to be as epic necessarily as something that would be on console or PC.
To kind of expand on something that Harris said, you know, just a little bit ago, is about getting your hands on, you know, the playable part of the game as soon as possible. Even beyond that, is I would say that even though your job is to come up with a story and focus on crafting sort of the whys of the universe and the narrative part that keeps players excited and moving forward, I would say is that if you can, get in and mess around with the tools that you have, even if you're not necessarily building the level. Get in there and screw around with what the engine can do, or what they've set up can do, because that will help you generate ideas. And if you're working with something that already I know this works within the universe, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to integrate your ideas into sort of how the world works. So I would recommend that.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with the level designers, actually, because they're building everything that we're playing within, and just so I know what we can do and what we can't do. But answering your question you asked about coming into a project with everything already established, to me that can be a really fun challenge too. It's almost like solving a puzzle. It's a game in itself, trying to make all these disparate parts kind of fit together in a way that makes some kind of like logical sense. And that's I really want the player not to feel like this story is completely nonsensical. And a lot of time it's talking to the developers and trying to have them see it from the player's point of view in terms of the story, and making sure that they understand, because they have this story in their mind already sometimes, but the player may not be seeing that story, or there may not be enough information for the player to even understand that story. And so a lot of that is when someone's been so close to it for a long time, it's kind of good to bring someone from the outside in and kind of see it with a fresh perspective. So that's that's part of taking all those pieces and fitting them together as well.
I would mainly just echo all of the statements already said by my fellow panelists. As a narrative designer, as a writer, you are often thrown into the box of rocks problem. It's deeply exciting, especially if you know that you're running into this coming in. One question I'd actually have, if I can introduce one for the group, is on several projects, I've been brought in with the box of rocks problem, but we weren't allowed to see what the game is being built in or what it looks like. All we had was our list of requirements and the words for a variety of legal and process and workflow reasons. So we literally could not see the game as we were working on it. Have you ever been thrown into those situations yourselves? And how do you deal with the box of rocks when you can't see what rocks are in the box?
I had a project that I was working on that it was something where it was actually involved several government agencies were involved, because this was a kind of edutainment kind of project that I was working on. And so it involved several different agencies within the government that I had to pass through information through. The hard part is that there was a lot of barriers between departments in terms of what was allowed to be communicated from one department to the other. If you were confused about certain things, that there was a chain of command in terms of if you had a question, it had to go through like 5 or 6 other individuals to somebody else. And all those people in that chain are not necessarily savvy to tech and other issues. And so it was maddening. I certainly would hope that in most game companies you wouldn't have quite such heavy firewalls between the people you're dealing with, but it's a pain, and it takes a lot of time to kind of fit yourself into the headspace of these other people. So I'm not allowed to actually talk to these people directly, but it's like reading. Trying to, it's like I'm getting cryptic notes from the other side, and I'm trying to decrypt what's actually being said. So hopefully none of you have had problems quite that arcane, but yeah, I know what that's like.
Yeah, I've been lucky actually. I've never had that experience where I couldn't actually see what the game was, or at least some idea of what it was going to be. Though there are times that they gave me the box of rocks, and I've like built something, and then I bring it back to them and I say, "Oh, we changed all the box of rocks. We changed all the things in the box. So all these things that you came up with don't really work for this box of rocks anymore. So here's the new box of rocks." So it's,
What was an unexpected thing that you had to problem solve regarding a story or those rocks?
Well, I'll tell you a big one. When I was working on the Dying Light originally, that one I got to work right from the beginning. And we were going to do, it was 4-person co-op. It was always going to be that. But we were going to tell the story from the perspective of all the 4 different characters. So whichever character you picked, you would kind of go through a different story. So I developed the story to work kind of differently, depending on which character you picked. And then, as happens, they got to a point where we can't afford to build that game. It's like, that's too many assets. That's 4 different stories we're going to be building, and so we basically, you could only choose one character. So even if you played co-op, it was basically the 4 same characters, though, and what we did to kind of make sense of that is that these were just your team. It was still, you were the main character, and the story is based around you, and the people who are joining are just your team. But that was a big change. I mean, that, we basically had to start from scratch and threw out a lot of stuff. So, but that's just the nature of this business, I think.
Well, it's just you're trying to decide to do Rashomon the game.
And then that kind of touches on too, there's that balance you have to try to find often between player agency and your role as a storyteller. How can you get your story told? If you're classically trained as a writer, you've probably been told that there should really only be one logical, true ending to your story. And, then with games, there's possibilities of different paths and different outcomes. And so can you speak to that a little bit, trying to make it so it's not just what some people call a cattle chute or whatever, and you just go through, and having the player sometimes within those budget constraints that come up have some kind of sense that this is their path and their story.
I think one of the take-home messages you get for a traditional feature film, for example, is that the ending should be surprising, but in retrospect, inevitable. Yeah. And I think that's something to keep in mind, is that if it's supposed to be surprising, then it could have played out any number of ways. And I think, for example, The Witcher, the first Witcher, I was one of the writers for. I didn't come up with the main story, but they had 3 branched endings, and they set it up. First of all, the main character is amazing and nuanced, but they set it up so whatever choice you made was still in character for him, and he's so nuanced. Anything he does is going to be, surprising in one sense, because you're like, wow, I would have thought you did the other thing. And so I think you just have to make your characters richer, or if it's the player, obviously, give them lots of options and let them surprise themselves. But I think that's definitely it. It's like, I always want to be like, well, where is the player right now? What are they thinking? What is where they're going? Mm-hmm. What are they excited by? What's pulling them forward? And keep that in mind, rather than, me imposing some, like, this is how you are. So hopefully that made sense.
I love that. No, I love that. That's a wonderful point about if it's, unexpected, then there's a number of ways to do that. All right. Anything else?
I think a critical piece. Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
How'd you?
Okay. All right. So what I was just going to say is that whenever I got in the industry, it was a very different kind of thing. It was very much as you kind of described, the cattle chute. Is the fact that you're going to go here and you're going to go here and you're going to go here. It's a very linear kind of progression. You might have a little side quest off to the to the right or the left, but ultimately you're really just going down a very linear path. And I think that games have evolved a great deal, so that now that it's less about here's this exact journey that you're going to take. And I always like to say is that in the old days, the writer's job or the narrative designer's job was basically you're the drill sergeant. Go here, do this. Mm. And now I think a good narrative designer's job is more like a cruise director. It says, well, this is what's going on the Lido deck today, and you can do shuffleboard or what have you. And so you give the player a lot of options, and it's still you're thinking about in a larger picture rather than here's this hard. You're thinking of story as a particular path from A to Z, and rather you can look at story instead as here is this sort of ball that you're inside of. it's not a straight line, is the fact that the story is actually the world itself. And you get to basically kind of peel the layers of the onion in whichever way you want to kind of reveal whatever is sort of lying underneath. And the player has a lot more flexibility in that. So you're giving the player options, not orders, is the way I look at it.
Yeah, going from linear games, and I started working on open world games, which didn't exist when I first started. The technology wasn't there, but that was a big change, and a big change in terms of how to think about a story in a game. I'm not, and some, like The Witcher actually does it really well. The last Witcher, I thought, did a fantastic job with that open world story. And that's a challenge because, you go up. And so I started to think of it more like almost like a TV season, where different parts of this open world are like different episodes in the TV season. It was just a way to kind of keep it all in my head. But I love branching storylines, and I'm always trying to convince developers to put them in and have like multiple endings. But, I worked on a VR game last year and a half ago, and I really wanted to do that, but it was just too expensive with VR for them to so they decided against it. But yeah, the last Call of Juarez game had a branching storyline, and to me it was integral to the theme of the game and the story of this character. You could either go dark or go light, and it was really the player's own instincts, whichever way they wanted to go, it would take you there, and then the story ended depending on. But it's it makes the technology is harder, and it also is many more assets need to be created for branching storylines.
Testing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, you mentioned testing, and thank you so much, Harris, for bringing up about the open world and branching things. I was hoping we could touch on that, but
Yeah.
I know a lot of people that tune into this are interested in going into the field. So can you take a moment, at least a few of you, to describe what realistically might be the kind of entry-level writing work an aspiring narrative designer might take on? Like, for a lot of people, it might be writing dialogue trees, or, writing incidental responses to things. Can you address some of the things that are pretty common things to have to do at the beginning?
Lots of barks, lots of little pieces that fill out the world. Especially when you're dealing with an open world game. I love that Harris brought that up. You've got so many pieces that make that up. You have text, you have audio, you have audio from characters you never even see. You have audio logs. You have enemies that have to shout things at you. This is another place where being familiar with what tools you have and what is actually happening in the game is deeply useful. If it's really easy for us to just put text on a piece of paper and have it in the world, then that might be a piece of your starting level work. In other situations, it might actually be cheaper just because of bulk to have a lot of story come out through how enemies respond to you. So a lot of entry level work is very much going to revolve around filling in pieces of a world that already has so much going on. So the more you know about how to support other pieces of a fundamental story, the more capable you will be to achieve that challenge.
And as a game player, that is most of what you see when you play the game. And so I think that stuff is just as important as the central storyline to creating that world. I mean, I think the barks could be really important, because if you start to hear the same barks over and over again and they're lame, you just feel like everything is lame. And so every single, the story is as strong as its weakest link. So each of those, everything like, the recordings you might find along the way, I think all of it is equally important.
I want to give you major props, by the way. The stuff that you did in Command and Conquer, the barks that you had for unit orders, love that stuff.
Oh,
love that.
And then can you explain for those that aren't familiar what a bark is?
A bark is generally speaking is that it's usually a random bit of text that whenever you give a character an order, so you tell them that you need to move over here, or to equip an item, or for each game it depends on what activities the player is engaging in. But these are just small little things that they aren't related to the main storyline. They're something that provide character gives a little bit of personality to various different characters. And so when you click on them or give them orders, they'll say some really quick little thing they'll say. And of course it becomes sort of their tag or their catchphrase. And so after a while, particularly with some of these other some games, it's just like, it's one of the things you love about the game is just hearing, them playing, firing up and, these little things they'll say.
Yeah,
Grenade! It's a grenade! Duck and cover!
It's a trap. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it a lot. So trying to find 15 different ways to say grenade out can be difficult.
Yeah.
So for combat games, or first-person shooters, the enemies, a lot of the enemies have their own lines that they're shouting out at you as they're trying to kill you, and also part of those barks is tells the player what's going on. If you're being attacked being flanked or whatever. So it's partly gameplay direction too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's right.
And it has the potential to be entertaining or maddening, depending on how much or whatever is going on. Now, I wanted to make sure we cover, if somebody is trying to break into the field, what do you recommend they have to present? A portfolio? What type of background or material would you like to see if somebody is a likely candidate for an entry-level narrative-related position?
Well, I think it definitely varies. Some companies, they don't even need to see any writing samples. You could submit, if they like your resume, for example, they will have you do a writing test straight out, so you don't even need samples. A lot of people recommend doing your own Twine games, just creating something that you can show that's produced in-game. Obviously, from text to voiceover, that's also helpful. When I broke in, so to speak, I was using TV scripts as samples. They tend to be very flexible about what they're willing to read. I've sent short stories as samples. And I think generally that when someone is like, oh, send me your samples, they want something that just matches whatever game they're working on. And then from there, they might have you do a writing test if they want to continue, and try to get paid for the writing test.
The important piece, especially on the hiring side, is usually, as Ann will say, people are just kind of looking for something that they're already looking for. So the more varied your samples are, if you have done writing for a first-person game and an open-world game and a role-playing game and a strategy game, whatever this very specific case is, they're just going to be looking for that. You can be the best entry-level writer in the world, but if you don't have an urban fantasy sample and they're looking for urban fantasy and they see someone who's written urban fantasy, that's instantly going to go way higher up the list. So getting a wide variety of experiences and building up a portfolio as soon as possible, even if it's just your own work, is essential. And that's one way that game jams can be great. If every game jam you collaborate with someone making a different type of thing, you have more opportunities to demonstrate and build a greater variety of skills.
And I gotta add that this is like the amazing thing about the game industry is that they're so open to writers who write in different genres and even different styles. I've worked on an NBA game. I've worked on fantasy games. I just worked on Beyond Blue, which was a underwater contemporary exploration game. And they're totally open. Like, as long as they're like, oh, this writing works and we believe that you're competent, they'll bring you on. And it's the exact opposite in Hollywood. I've been asking this question repeatedly. I was just reading this today. What do you do if you work in different genre, which I do? And they're like, no, stick to one genre. And then maybe if you're lucky, like you'll have, they might let you do something else. And it's ridiculous. It's like, I've done so many different things in games and they don't care. Like, it's so weird, but that's why games are awesome.
Yeah, that's my experience too. Because I had come out of writing screenplays, and I wrote mostly comedies, and so that's what people thought I could do. That I would never. They would never hire me to write a horror movie or an action movie. Where in games, it's been so great. Is I've written every single genre you can possibly imagine. Right? So and now that I have them all, I have like all those samples you talked about, so I can send them different samples. I do wonder if it's helpful to like write in other mediums, if that helps impress companies somewhat. It felt like for me it did, the fact that I had credits in other areas. But I think when you're just starting out, sometimes if you're, I think there's two different ways of getting in, right? You could either have some other credits, and other, writing other kinds of things, and they hire you, bring you in as a writer, or you start on the ground floor at a game company doing something else, and you also have writing skills, and then they learn, you kind of explain that to them as you're working either in Q&A or wherever you're working on, and that's another way to break in. It's like, seems to be the two ways people do it.
Yeah,
all right.
If I can, what we were saying earlier, someone said earlier, how everybody is creative. Everyone carries the narrative in a game company. So you don't have to be a writer or narrative designer to champion the narrative and to help tell the story. You can do that in any department. You can do that in engineering. I'm not even joking. So don't feel like, oh, I care about story, I can only be a writer. No, you can do this in any department. And we want you there. We want people who care about narrative in all the departments. So that would be great.
That is an excellent way to wrap up a lot of what we're talking about here. But I want to make sure each one of you has the chance to tell us, tell everybody watching where they can find you, either on social media or a website, and or the project that you're working on right now, if people would like to just kind of keep up with what you're doing. So Harris, would you like to start off with that?
Sure. You can find me at harrisorkin.com. That's Harris with one R, and the games I'm working on right now, I can't really. They haven't been revealed. They're going to be revealed soon, though, because E3 didn't happen this year. So because of that, things are being revealed in kind of a staggered way. But I'm working. I can tell you the genres I'm working. I'm working on a sniper game. I'm working on a comedy ninja game. and I'm working on another Western, actually.
Great.
So,
well, that's why we ask,
yeah.
That's why we ask for where people can find you, because we know some of it is not yet ready to be disclosed. Xalavier, how about you?
I'm making a bunch of stuff all the time. You can find me on Twitter at WRIT Nelson. And if you want to check out something I just launched a game, a psychological thriller survival comedy game.
Oh, that sounds
called,
great.
Mr. Bucket Told Me To. It's like Castaway. If Wilson wanted you to die a slow and painful death, and that's on the DreadX collection on Steam right now.
Awesome.
Sounds fun. Anne, how about you?
All right. So you can find me most readily on Twitter. My handle is Emily. It's A-M as in Mary, E-L-Y. And I am working on a variety of games on different different platforms at the moment. And Beyond Blue, which is one of the games I worked on, just came out on Apple Arcade, and it's now, I believe, available on all platforms, including Switch. Horizon Zero Dawn, the original game, is announced that it'll be coming out on PC this year, so you can play it on PC if you haven't played it on the PS4. And I also have a short story in a Star Wars anthology that is a charity anthology that will be coming out later this year as well. So there will be lots of opportunities to read some of the stuff I worked on. Oh, and I also worked on the comic book for Horizon Zero Dawn that bridges the two games, and that should be coming out later this year as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne. Neal, how about you?
Me, I'm ridiculously easy to find on the internet. So you can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, just Neal Hallford, like you see on the screen with my name here. Also, Jana and I have a multimedia company. In addition to working on game content, one of the big things over the past couple of years, we've been working on an audio drama series. Harris wrote a terrific episode for us called Trail of Fears. And so we're going to be pushing out that series. Hopefully, we were hoping last year, but we're going to have to probably do it this coming year because we had some issues with my health earlier this year. But I'm back
And the world in general.
And yes,
that's true.
And yes, the world has kind of shut things down for a little while, but that's okay. But anyway, so check out Uncharted Regions, which is the name of our audio drama series. And so if you like Twilight Zone kind of stuff, that's what we're doing right now. So, and that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you so much, each of you. This has been a great panel, and thank you, audience, for tuning in. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.